دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and welcome to the second interview of On Finding Me on the ITV networks. Today again with my guest Ndumiso Dladla, an individual I have mentioned previously, I'm saying it again, with an extraordinary mind, outstandingly, innovative in his thought, and very, very deep, so that when you listen to Ndumiso, you're forced to question. And I think, Ndumiso, thank you again once again for making yourself available, but I think maybe it's part of your profession. Philosophers ask questions and then they provoke questions, eh?
Right. I would hope so, certainly.
So, okay, so when we ended in the previous interview, you said that you were fortunate enough to always live amongst and study with individuals who are already engaging in these discussions, and one of your mentors is Professor Ramose. I mean, that's also an incredible mind.
Yes.
But how do we take this tradition forward? Because if I look at the South African university, if I look at the resistance from those who control and manage the universities, everybody's not fortunate like you, for instance, to find a Ramose, to go and search for somebody like him, or students might not be fortunate enough to come and seek out Ndumiso, but there are maybe hundreds like you who have the potential, the capacity, the intelligence, the wisdom, the knowledge to share all of these traditions. This knowledge, this identity that makes you proud to be African, as reversed to the inferiority complex that many of the African students feel. How are we going to challenge this when the universities are pushing back all the time, preventing exactly this from happening?
I think the situation in South Africa is anomalous because the people who created the problem of the exclusion of the indigenous people from the universities and the exclusion also of their experience and knowledge from the university were the same people who were given the responsibility after 1994 to undo that situation. This is anomalous even in logical terms, because those who stand to benefit from the unchanging nature of the situation are also given the responsibility to change that situation. These are the people that developed that system and continue to benefit from its lack of change. So I think this was an error. I don't know whether we call it optimism or neglect, but I think that there was supposed to be a much more hands-on approach to the universities and to their change. I think a principle such as academic freedom in certain ideological hands can be abused, just as the freedom of expression or the freedom of the press. It has to be limited and subjected to the interests of the indigenous people. I think it's a freedom which is not the freedom of the people, but the freedom of the few to exploit the many. So in many other African countries, perhaps they were lucky not to have inherited infrastructure in terms of universities in a similar way to us, which were founded by other people and run by them to the exclusion of the people of the land. So many of these countries developed new universities at independence, which were undergirded by a very strong emphasis on African nationalism.
Is this what we see in the rest of Africa, for instance?
That's right. So we see the Ibadan School of History, we see the University of Dar es Salaam, the University of Makerere, which were all exceptional centers that produced really remarkable African intellectuals as well as work, highly original reinterpretations of history, of philosophy, of literature, So that kind of intellectual activity, we have no precedent of it in South Africa. What we've had is just the inclusion of the children of the conquered people on the master's table, made to reproduce the same kind of colonial mimesis that was going on before. There was never really a rupture to reconsider the very disciplines themselves in light of liberation. That is the liberation of the university itself, following from the liberation of society, which we would argue is still unliberated to date, you know.
So is there a solution for us as South Africans? I mean, you know, we were having a discussion recently, and from the many forms of transformation, one of them that's proposed is a radical transformation before you can get to transformation as decolonization. And I mean, radical transformation eventually, or in most instances, has meant violence before you can actually get to that point where you can start again and imagine this new humanism. But my fear is that if we come to that point without being able to do this radical transformation without violence, the perpetual stereotype that is perpetrated against the black student will always be that you can only do things through violence. It's a catch-22 situation. Is there a way out?
Well, I think, you know, the discourse on violence is peppered with a deep degree of hypocrisy. The problem is that South Africa is a country which has been unspeakably violent for more than 350 years. The very foundation of South Africa as a polity, as an entity, was the result of unspeakable violence. The so-called Anglo-Boer War, which established the Union of South Africa, was a war which killed and butchered a lot of the indigenous people themselves, who are not supposed parties of this war. And so the arrival of Van Riebeeck itself, you know, was a genocidal war which cost almost the entire population of Khoisan people. So the very establishment of the universities, the land which they are built on, is a story which is written in blood of those who wipe their hallways when the white students have gone and cleaned their toilets, and who have built those universities quite literally with their labor, you know. And so this is a story which is left outside of the university. A lot of the students who study at the universities themselves return to a serious and unethical violence that is called the township. You know, I mean, and I think township is really a euphemism for concentration camp. South Africa, I would argue, despite being celebrated for having averted a civil war in 1994, really is a place which is in a perpetual state of war. Many of our statistics of violence here at home are described as the highest in a place outside of war. Highest rate of rape in a place outside of war. Highest rate of murder in a place outside of war. The only problem with this description is that it assumes that there isn't a war. The problem is that instead of the war having been between the conqueror and the conquered people, it was actually internalized to eat its very victims themselves in the concentration camps they were placed in. And so all kinds of so-called black violence are represented as xenophobic violence, homophobic violence, misogynistic violence, but the underlying principle is that black people are placed in a historical and political condition that makes black life very cheap and easily available to violence. And that violence is extremely profitable for the white people and mainstream society that benefits from these labor concentration camps, which pass in these workers and pass them out. And this is tied to the history of the dispossession of land. So immediately these people who are usually dying in shack fires, who are beaten to death at the slightest provocation in their day-to-day lives, bring this situation onto the campus and burn a few books in the library. Suddenly, violence becomes the most unspeakable horror and sign of barbarism. When people are continually subjected by these very nice, green, serene places we stay in, they have an underside, which is continually the people that cut the grass, where they go back to. You know, in order for us to enjoy our peace, there's an unspeakable violence that is happening. So when the violence comes to the garden, it pierces this veil of hypocrisy which we safely live beyond. And so I think violence really is not something new. It's just that violence has been monopolized in a certain space and kept away from the rest of us. And when the violence we enjoy the fruits of suddenly comes into view, we are filled with disgust and horror. But I think this is hypocrisy which really must be confronted. If we are enemies of violence, then we should be concerned about the ethical problem of the existence of the township and what that means about our society.
And is that now in a way linked to your whole critique of this liberal non-racialism concept as well? Because in speaking about the liberal racism that you feel, that you spoke about the two strands, the one was the conservative and the one is the liberal, perhaps it is that through the pursuance of this liberal ideology, we forget about this violences, or that we are made to believe that it doesn't exist.
Right. I mean, so the point is that the liberals are happy with the blacks like me that sit on the grass and speak English with them. We can talk about Foucault together and see our common humanity, and that common humanity comes from my violent conversion through colonial education, through displacement, into becoming more like them. Then I can be accepted as a human
So you've
being.
integrated into their
Right.
society.
So if I follow the terms which they set for dialogue, then certainly we are supposed to be equals, and we are supposed to celebrate this progress of our having become equal. On the other hand, those people who are left out of this system, and as a result they are not able to speak the conqueror's language, or partake in his games of etiquette, and are portrayed as savages, as animals, as a threat, a problem which needs to be managed, without recognizing that these systems, I mean, they are coterminous. They create each other. We can only enjoy the one because the other one happens. So it's this hypocrisy. The conservative says, blacks are animals and so must live in animal conditions. The liberal one is much more hypocritical.
More dangerous then also.
I believe it is far more dangerous because it's not explicit.
We have to go to a break, but when we come back, I want to bring this now to a full South African context on what is happening. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of the second interview today with Ndumiso Dladla. We're talking about the ideas and the philosophical understandings in his excellent book, Here is a Table. Now, Ndumiso, before we went into the break, you spoke about the liberal strand, which is far more dangerous. Perhaps you can then explain to us, is it within this kind of framework that we find the black elite of South Africa, who are supposed to represent, who are supposed to come from a tradition of consciousness, who should be aware of these things that you're speaking about, of the township as a concentration camp, of the entrapments of violence, that you can enjoy the peace because you're keeping that particular violence at bay. People who should know this, but who now represent in a way, who are fronted this black image, but are creating more harm. Every day when money is stolen from the coffers, it is a cost to the black individual who's particularly living in that township. It takes away from the rise in inflation. You have opportunities in terms of lost education. I mean, the reluctance of the government to allow for no fees education. Those are things, these are costs that black people are still paying. But the conversation, again, exactly as it has been perpetuated, blacks are barbaric, they are non-human, they are violent, they do not have capacity. The other one that's perpetuated is black people can't rule. And what we see playing out then in the government is exactly this, and people are saying, but didn't we tell you? How do you address this?
Well, I think, this is a manifestation of a historical problem. If you want to study the history of the Congress movement itself, I would argue that it isn't necessarily the representation of an African tradition in politics to begin with, or in ethics, And so, as I say, whereas in many places, these problems of the universities, of the epistemological paradigms, which would rule over the society were part of the political program. In South Africa, we don't really have a kind of equivalent thing happening with the movement that saw the end of the day. For instance, people don't understand that the Congress, the ANC, can be described as a civil rights movement rather than a liberation movement. And this is a conclusion which was reached by other African countries as well. When the ANC was asked to leave Mozambique, and Samora Machel made a deal with Botha to get them out in order to have peace in Mozambique. One of his generals made the point that the reason why they can't afford to let Mozambicans die is because these guys are not a liberation movement. They never questioned the right of the Boers, of whites in general, to lord over the state as such, as it was. What they wanted was just for blacks to receive rights to participate in that system.
So they wanted a place at the table.
Exactly. So this corruption that you are speaking of, because this system is inherently corrupt, I'm opposed to the making of a distinction between these kinds of corruption, because we must understand really South Africa itself, in its very foundation, as a corrupt nation, which is built on land which is stolen, which develops a history of one group of people who have access to amenities at the expense of others who provide labor. This is a historically corrupt situation for at least 400 years. Now, the objective of the civil rights movement was to gain access to a share of this corrupt activity. The alternative was flattening this very order and succeeding and beginning a completely new state, beginning with questioning the very territory, the provinces, and their representation. The name South Africa itself was, for the Congress, never something which was problematic. And yet, if you look at the idea of South Africa historically, South Africa is a white man's country. Even grand apartheid was about the decitizenization of blacks. Blacks were, by the height of apartheid, no longer South African citizens. They were citizens of their homelands. South Africa itself, by definition, was a white man's country. Now, was the objective to make blacks into South Africans, or to bring South Africa to an end? So what we are seeing now is the continuation of South Africa, which is a country in which those with power enjoy the subjugation of those without. It's just that a few of our brothers and sisters have been admitted onto this table. But the objective is really, something quite different. So, this is how I understand the problem.
So some of the students who are discussing this whole notion of transformation and decolonization are struggling with certain understandings. For example, they feel that, reimagining institutional culture, for example, every time they want to change something, they are told, but this is tradition. So for example, if there's a song, and I'm thinking right now about our national anthem, do we then just add in a few black verses, from black languages, and then say it's transformation? I mean, what would be your response? For example, even to these house students, they have their house mandates and their house cultures or whatever. So do we just, add a little black and stir, and then it's new? Or what would be your vision or your understanding if we look at through the thoughts of Sobukwe and Biko?
Exactly that. What we did have is an addition of black and stir. And Biko predicted this, He in the 70s famously said that if the Boers want to maintain apartheid, they simply need to admit a few blacks into their ranks. And this will ensure that it lasts for far longer, because they can claim to be changing the system while subduing those who are left out and leaving them with the hope that they can somehow also be included in the system eventually. And strangely enough, this is exactly what has come to pass. As far as the approach to this situation, I think that the black consciousness approach remains pertinent. So, for instance, we reached the conclusion earlier this year as black philosophers that it was necessary for us to stop seeking this inclusion in the philosophical society of South Africa, which is a white philosophy society, which for many years continued a white philosophical program, even supporting the apartheid state. Many of the members of the white philosophical community of South Africa were actually agents of the Boers who were ousting people as communists. And you know, there's a very long and sordid history of these institutions as they've participated in the erection and maintenance of white supremacy. So the idea that we need to be included and somehow this would change is something that we came to reject. And we undertook as black philosophers and people outside of the discipline of philosophy involved in the theoretical aspects of the various disciplines to found a new society, which we call the Azanian Philosophical Society, which begins at the root by questioning the very ethical tenability of South Africa itself and recognizing this as a philosophical problem, that South Africa poses an ethical problem itself and is something which thought should be directed against. The objective should be towards the ending of South Africa, because South Africa has existed for far too long. So,
but that ending does not necessarily mean a genocidal ending. It can be a better ending, isn't it? It's
right.
how we imagine it, how we envision it.
Right. Look, if one understands that race, for instance, despite its pretensions to biology, is really the description of ideas, you know. So as I said, whites are a relation. It's a relationship. What needs to be brought to end is a relationship. It is possible theoretically for this relationship to come to an end without violence. Human history is unfortunately peppered with a resistance to the ending of unethical situations by dialogue. But certainly, if something like the Constitution was dissolved, there isn't a reason why a democratically elected government with parliamentary supremacy shouldn't be able to undo this situation through a series of concerted decisions and bring this outstanding problem to an end.
So it depends where the heart is eventually, isn't it?
That's right.
And I think what I want to raise with you very quickly, because we're out of time, is that you're speaking about this philosophical society in South Africa, but in your trips overseas, and especially in Europe, you encountered a totally different kind of mindset?
Yes, I mean, white South Africans, I mean, can really be described as having a commitment to ignorance. It isn't simply our philosophy that they do not know and have no interest in knowing, even despite pronouncing themselves to be experts in Ubuntu, you know, without any command of the Bantu languages or cultures. But it's precisely outstanding to me that after 400 years of presence on the land, generally they don't speak any of our languages. This can only happen through a very concerted effort, you know. And yet it isn't necessary that it be so. There is no such thing as a white brain which cannot understand the African languages. This is a relationship of power. And certainly it is curious to see the possibility of engaging in a dialogical format with peoples from around the world if they take the injunction seriously.
And you saw that in Germany?
I was surprised, you know, to attend a philosophy conference with Europeans who were teaching much of the work which we are fighting to get included in the South African curriculum, and who were speaking many of the languages South African whites would have us believe it is impossible for them to acquire, while at the same time sending their children to Deutsch Schule to study the very German of these people, you know.
Yeah, so it's a huge hypocrisy, I think, and a double standard in academia. And it's something that we need to continue fighting. And so for that, we need you and more of the youth and the young minds to come forward, to write more books, to open up and to engage with the people in the society of South Africa, to show them that, you know what, we don't only have potential, but we're very capable. So we're at the end, and I want to say thank you very much. Thank you for doing this and for always sharing your ideas and your thoughts.
No, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
في أمان الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
ودين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار